Hi, I'm Jasmine, and this is Not Another PD. It's for helping professionals who are tired of theoretical training that doesn't translate to the work you actually do. Here, we talk boundaries, leadership, systems, and how to protect your well-being while doing complex work every day. I'm so glad you're here. Episode 30. Welcome back to Not Another PD. Today, we're having a chat about ethical leadership in complex disability environments. And my guest, Kelvin, and I previously worked alongside each other in a compulsory treatment setting with people with disabilities who presented with high-risk behaviours. In those environments, leadership decisions carry real weight. They affect people with high complexity needs, their families, frontline staff, as well as the broader community. There is an ongoing tension between protecting human rights and also protecting public safety. Today, we're unpacking the psychosocial impact of those of us holding risk in our professional roles and also as leaders, and the importance of boundaries. Today, I'm joined with Kelvin Kamara, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Hopewell Community Care. He is a senior leader in Australia's disability services sector with more than a decade of experience leading teams and services that support people with disability to live full and independent lives. He has held regional leadership roles overseeing multi-site operations and large teams, and is known for building strong cultures, developing leaders, and improving service quality across really complex environments. Alongside his work in the sector, Kelvin serves as an Australian Army reservist and is currently progressing through the Australian Army's part-time officer training continuum, reflecting his commitment to both leadership and service. Kelvin brings a thoughtful and practical perspective on leadership and building organisations that genuinely make a difference. I'm so thrilled to have you join me. Welcome, Kelvin. Great to see you again.
Good to see you again, Jasmine. I'm super excited. Thank you for those such kind words. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
When you're supporting people with really complex behaviours of protest, particularly where there can be an interaction sometimes with the legal system as well, how do you personally think about the balance between protecting their human rights and also the focus on community safety?
That's a great question to start. I think that balance is probably one of the most challenging part of being a leader in the disability sector. Because first thing, when you talk about behaviors of protest, we need to remember that those behaviors are often a form of communication. And so I usually use the word behavior of protest. We've come a long way in terms of how we go behaviors of concern or challenging behaviors. I rather use the language of behavior of protest because someone is pretty much, in a way, trying to communicate something to you. And usually that form of communication can reflect, trauma, environmental stress, unmet needs, a lack of control in their lives in some cases. But at the same time, we also have to acknowledge that there's a very real impact those behaviors will have on other people, particularly staff that are supporting this person. So a real example of where this tension show up is when a staff member is impacted by an incident, either whether it be psychological or physical. When this happens, it's very common for teams to strongly advocate for increased restrictive practice because their immediate concern is their safety. And that often can lead to some ethical challenges. So as a leader, you always try to understand and acknowledge the experiences of the staff member. You want to support them appropriately and ensure the team feels safe. And while also recognizing that any restrictive practice directly impact the human rights of the people who support. So the role becomes less about choosing a side, and it's more about supporting the team to navigate a very complex situation, which might involve some of the work we do with, the wider care team, which is where I first sort of connected with you previously.
Thanks, Kelvin. And for those of us listening in our audience who may not be working in sort of that more complex disability space, could you just briefly give us a bit of an outline of what you're talking about when you say restrictive practices?
So restrictive practices, unauthorized sort of restraint, whether it be chemical, environmental, mechanical, has been deemed appropriate and less, the less restrictive way, in a sense, to be able to achieve an outcome, which in some cases to keep the individual with support safe. Usually in Victoria, we're unique enough where we have to adhere to the Disability Act 2006, which is where we do have interaction with Victorian senior practitioners, but also adhering to those NDIS quality and safeguarding standards. So a restrictive practice is just something that has been authorized by clinicians who are qualified in that sort of space to say this is the least restrictive thing we can implement in someone's life to keep them safe. And one of the best things I like to add to that is to say it's ongoing. We're going to review it with the long-term intention to fade that out, because you want to put restrictions in place to eventually create an environment where you can teach skills and develop the person in a space where they'll be able to effectively communicate in some cases without necessarily having to have restrictive practice in place where you keep both them, the individual supporting, the staff, and the community safe.
Thanks, Kelvin. And, essentially, for those of us who've worked in the space before, that even imposing restrictive practices on a client or on a participant is a breach of their human rights that none of us take lightly in our role. And it's probably the least favorite part of the role of, I'm sure, of a lot of the frontline staff that you've supported over time. Is definitely a complex challenge and challenging place to work, but also very rewarding as well. We both acknowledge that working in the space in which sometimes there could be that ethical tension between what we think is ethically right and then what we're asked to do by our organizations or as part of our role. So sometimes things sit maybe uncomfortably with us in some of the psychosocial hazards that frontline staff, but also leaders such as yourself, the impact over time that working in this complex environment can have. Is there an example that you can perhaps give around the impact that you've seen both on yourself as a leader, but also some of your frontline staff around some of these psychosocial or psychological hazards that they experience in their daily work?
So before I probably give an example, I also want to say it's such a common thing in terms of the complex environment we work in and the significant psychosocial impact they have on leaders and staff, but we don't necessarily talk about it openly. Frontline staff are often supporting people in very vulnerable and intense situations, and over time that can create cumulative stress. So a really good example I can think of around the moral distress is, you see staff members supporting somebody who engages or display behaviors of protest, and in some cases are so intense that could involve property damage, and the environment becomes physically unsafe. And sometimes you can also even go to the point where staff might have some sort of impact to them, whether it be physically, emotionally. And I just want to talk a little bit more what the thing that we don't talk about often because it doesn't show up in the data, which is that moral stress that where staff often see what the right supporter approach should look like, right? And they want to remain close to a person to support them and support them through an escalation and maintain relational stability. But sometimes the environment they work in, whether it be the infrastructure, whether it be in the staffing ratio, whether it be in the funding constraints, don't allow them to do that safely. So staff know what to do, but because of those challenges that are outside of their control, are not able to do the right thing, and that could cause a lot of moral distress. Because staff know what good support looks like most of the time. Most of them, and a lot of people that work in the sector have very good intentions, but they can also feel very restricted by the systems around them. So over time, that can involve in if it's not treated, which is some of the worst thing that can come up, might even evolve to some sort of moral injury, because people feel that they're unable to act in alignment with their professional values. A really good example of this in practice was we supported an individual who was subjected to an STR, and the environment we were supporting him was so damaged that staff could not physically be there all the time to provide the level of supervision he required. And as a result, this individual felt very isolated, and which also just compounded on the presentations that we're having. So staff knew what the right thing to do. They wanted to do their jobs, but because of the environmental constraints they found themselves in, could not do the right thing. And I think that's why organizations and us working in the sector, leaders, we need to take that psychosocial safety very seriously. And there are multiple ways we can do that. And some of the work you do now, firsthand, I've seen the work you do in helping us being able to communicate to teams that are working in sort of environment, but most importantly, some of the work you do now, coaching and helping people who work in an environment where they support other people is much needed and appreciated.
Thanks so much, Kelvin, for your kind words. And I just want to explain to our listeners the acronym STO is Supervised
Sorry.
Treatment Order. That's a Victorian centric term, and I originate from Victoria as well, which is how Kelvin and I connected. But I'm now based in Queensland. Different states and territories would have kind of different words for essentially the same thing, but it's essentially a tribunal order that actually imposes significant levels of restrictive practice on an individual with an intellectual disability in Victoria. And Kelvin, right back at you. I saw the amazing work that you were doing as well, and you were coaching all your direct support staff through some really challenging situations. And something you mentioned around the isolation and the impact that has on this really vulnerable client group. And I heard something the other day, I think it was Brene Brown had said that. I'm just a big Brene Brown fan, and she'd said that for someone who experiences chronic loneliness, that's as poor for your health as the equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, which is so significant when we think about these individuals that are really, really vulnerable, and they do have these behaviours of protest, which do unfortunately at times place their immediate support staff and also the community at risk, that then their levels of isolation and then loneliness that they feel, when you talk about that moral injury or that moral distress, and that's something as well that I know sits so uncomfortably with yourself as a leader, but also the teams that you lead, and having to sit with that, knowing that someone's isolated and that it's not safe to currently approach them.
Yeah, no, absolutely spot on. Actually, that's very insightful data that you shared.
You've mentioned previously when we had some conversations outside of this recording that you've been refining a 4-step operating framework over the years that's actually led to some positive outcomes for the clients that you work with and for your teams. Is there anything that you can share about your approach that could also help any of our listeners out there who are actually wondering what they can do if they're working in a complex space such as what you're working in?
So at the heart of the framework is stability. One of the things that's susceptible a lot is breakdown in supports, whether it be in environmental or the staffing team. So the heart of the framework is stability and putting the human back in the center of all of that. So most of the time when we see behaviors escalating or environmental breakdown, it's really just one factor driving it. It's usually a combination of things. Workforce inconsistencies, health factors, environmental stress, support plans not being implemented effectively. So when we step into an environment where we have to support, where we have to provide support where things are broken down, the first thing we try to do is understand what's actually driving the instability. So the first step of the framework is understanding the risk and it's understanding the person. So what message are they communicating? Why are behaviors escalating? Why is it that there's a breakdown in the staffing team? What's happening in their health recently? What are the incidents that are coming up? What are they communicating to us? So understanding the person, understanding the risk. And then for us, that's where you're able to ask, get your threshold to say, this is actually a support that we need, or maybe not. This support that somebody else can provide, whether it be a more health-centric sort of support. The second part, we try to stabilize the support, whether it be stabilizing the environment or particularly through the workforce capacity. There's a document from the time we used to work for the Department of Health. It's called the Person-Centered Active Support Plan. And I think on page 3, there was a document that I love to reference. It says the characteristics of people that support me best. Right. This is where you've got an outline of all the characteristics of people who can best support this individual. So we do that deep dive and figure out who are the ideal people to work with this person, because you find out even when things are not necessarily going right, there are few people in the staffing team that can still still work effectively well with this individual. So what we try to do is, okay, what are they doing so well that we can potentially replicate? So you then start building out a pattern and getting a map for the characteristics of people that support this individual best. And then you're able to rapidly employ or deploy a workforce that can provide us support. The third part about it is working collaboratively with the clinical team, the allied health, the care team in general, is to have effective implementation of the necessary plans to ensure that there's not a breakdown. And what that looks like is proactive, reflective practices. So you start anticipating scenarios. You're doing reflective practice after incidents. You're doing coaching. You're doing mentoring. You're working alongside staff and to actually bring those support plans to life. And then finally, it's the governance. So we at Hopewell. So even historically, my time working for different organizations and what we're doing now at Hopewell is that governance oversight is present, which is to say, us as leaders, we're there with staff, we try to understand what's happening on the floor, so we're not getting secondhand information. So we have intentionally sort of developed Hopewell to have a flat organizational structure. But as you can tell, in my time when we worked together, I was present at the services. I was there working alongside staff. And then to add to that final step, not only the governance, but making sure we've got really, really good, strong documentation that supports what's currently happening and whatever change we want to see. And that's especially important in this sort of climate when you look at funding. Everything you do needs to relate back to the goals of the plan or what this, the participant or the person you support wants to achieve. So one, that ensures that you're able to track and make sure staff are doing the right thing, which is important, but you can also justify the current funding ratios, which you then ensure you can have that sustainable funds. But also, in the event where you need to get more funds, to get more support, you can then document what's happening and be able to go back and go, look, this is what we've seen and this is what the support we need moving forward. So in summary, 4 steps. The first step, understand the person, understand the risk. The second step is bespoke model of a staffer module. The third step is implementation of various support plans. And then finally is the governance and the documentation.
Thanks for explaining that so eloquently, Kelvin. As you were explaining that, some of the words that were coming to my mind was like ethical practice. It's really individualized and customized to the individual participant and their needs. So it's not like a one size fits all. You're actually seeing the client at the center of the service delivery, which I haven't seen a lot of leaders do that. Actually having the opportunities to actually check in with, even colleagues and managers sort of throughout the day, and that reflection that you embed throughout everything that you do is so important. Kelvin, I'd love to hear a little bit about what you currently do at Hopewell and what is it that you're so passionate about with the clients. Like, what made you step away from your or your senior leadership roles and now move into being the Chief Operating Officer at Hopewell?
So I just want to just look back and say one of the key things I'll say is a really important lesson for leaders in the sector is knowing that you don't always have the answers. And I think in this module we ran, whether it be with Scope or the department, about a sixth of all the hours of support delivered in a month was when the leaders was present, which means you rely about a fifth of the time is you're not there. And so you need to be able to empower your team to be able to do. So key point in this whole rant is humility. Knowing that you don't have all the answers and relying on your team members to be able to go, hey, actually, this is what we've seen. What does it look like for you? What can we do differently? And because they're there more often than you are. So that's my little spiel before I answer your question. And really good question. So part of the reason why we transition is I enjoy working more directly with the people. Naturally, the higher you get into any organizational leadership structure, the far removed you are from where the work actually gets done. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just I enjoy a bit of both. We work with people at the end of the day, and we're people ourselves. And human services are inherently human. So the moment you lose touch of that human side of things, you lose a very important part of what makes the sector whole, which is that we're working alongside people, and you need to be able to build those relationships and connections. So that's part of the reason why I stepped away, wanted to get more closely with what's happening on the floor, and then also being able to generate and build something from the start in support, working alongside my amazing wife who come with a very strong clinical background. So being able to take all the experience we've had over the years and go, okay, cool, this is what we've seen that is working, but most importantly, this is what we've seen that has not worked. And how do we then develop and build an organization, taking on from the lessons that we've seen that work and things that have not worked, and build something good that specifically catered to a niche group of people living with a disability that might have complex behaviors of practice and complex clinical support needs. And we do our best work actually where the two intersect, because there's a cohort of people who not only have complex behavioral practice, but have health related support that they need as well. And we know the challenges that this can have for those people. So being able to take all the lessons and implement in a boutique style, bespoke supports to people living with a disability, and also not wanting to lose a side of what's really important, which is the people support and be more close to the work.
I also always ask a question to my amazing guests around boundaries. So, is there a particular boundary that you have that really allows you to not overgive to your professional role and still have something left, for yourself and your life outside of work? Is there a boundary for you, Kelvin, that's so important?
This is one of those times where I might need to end up have those personal one-on-one calls with you, because I need to develop a strong boundary in how I work. Just being vulnerable and honest and open about it, because I frame it to say I've got a commitment bias, which is when I'm committed to something, like I need to get it done. Just trying to focus on the work where I might be when it's paying a bit more, a lot the attention that other areas of my life deserve. But I'm working on it, and I'm not perfect. So early in my career, I've always felt that if something complex was happening, I want to be there for my team. That was something that was really big. I want to be there as part of the team, because I was operating under this notion to say I'll never ask staff, for lack of a better word, to do something I'll never do myself. So I'll lead by doing, and leading from the front and show you that it can be done in cases where you need it. So I guess one boundary that is helping me now is leaning more towards the support around me. I don't know if that's a boundary in itself, but not necessarily putting myself in a position where I need to have all the answers. So and I would literally go, okay, cool, I don't know this. Can somebody else help me do this? And another thing we're also doing that I found very effective in my previous role is I was naturally just going into meetings or setting the agenda where I'll just lead the whole meeting myself. And I'll come out of those meetings feeling exhausted. Like, why is no one else contributing? Well, no one else is contributing because I've not asked anybody else to contribute, because I felt this need to do it all myself. So what I do now and what I've done then is to say, all right, we're having a meeting. This is what the meeting is about. This is what the responsibility for everybody else involved in the meeting is going to look like. And this is what we expect from everybody else. So I don't go into those meetings feel like I have to drive all the conversations and have all the answers. And it's actually quite empowering and for my team, but even for myself, I come out feeling a little less stressed and a little less burnt out than I have. But I definitely need to lean in a bit more to you and lean on your expertise of how I can develop stronger boundaries.
Well, thank you for your vulnerability, Calvin. And that's why these conversations are so important, because I'm sure a lot of leaders out there can thinking, oh, I can totally relate to everything that Calvin's saying. And even for myself, like having firmer boundaries has been a journey for me as well. I was definitely someone who was overgiving to everyone else and in my professional role. And sometimes especially when we're so led by our passions and our values, then sometimes we can lose ourselves, in the work, and then our whole identity can be wrapped up in our professional role. So I'm a work in progress too. Everyone's a work in progress.
And I'll say one last thing, sorry. Especially now as leaders, it's even more important because obviously there's a right to disconnect legislation that was passed. And what we're not recognizing as leaders is whatever we lead with, that's what our teams will most likely copy. And there's this unintended expectation that we'll put on our teams to say, well, if he's doing it, maybe it's an expectation that I need to do it, right? So we really drive in a really poor culture, or lack of a better word, we drive in this feeling that everybody needs to go above and beyond to the point where they're so burnt out. So it's really good to pause and reflect and set really good examples of setting good boundaries for ourselves as leaders, so our teams can then copy that and it becomes a culture that we share as an organization.
100%. And I can think of an example in a role that I was in, and I was in a leadership role supervising a small team, and there was this culture of continuing to work even when you're really medically unwell. So there were people coming to work when they really should have been in bed, or my pet peeve is when someone's unwell, oh, I'll just work from home. And I would say to them, if you're physically unwell enough to actually get in your car and drive to the office, then you're unwell to be working, regardless of whether that's at home or an office or a clinic. So yeah, that's one of the things that I did notice as well. And when leaders lead by example and actually say to their team, I'm actually really unwell, so I'm taking the day off, or I need to leave early because I have a medical appointment, then it gives permission to those around us to do the same and say, okay, well, if Kelvin's prioritizing his health, then, or Jazz is, and I can do the same. So I think you're definitely right. And we sometimes don't realize what we're role modeling as leaders if we've always done things a certain way and no one's ever challenged us saying like, oh, hey, when's the last time you've taken a day off? Or when's the last time you've actually left on time, right?
Yeah. So we have to do the actions that we change. So I think, but yeah, you're absolutely spot on.
Kelvin, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you, and I'm sure that everyone listening would love to know how they can connect with you and also find out more about Hopewell Community Care. How can people reach you?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. I'm still trying to work out a really good answer for this. And a website is a good place to start because it gives you a really snap introduction of who we are. There's also the how to contact us page. And because I understand one thing, we're not the provider for everybody, right? And whether it be, we will say no, you will say no, and that's absolutely fine. That's the whole essence of choice. So our website is a good place to start. You can just send an email onto the email address on the website, or you can just call the number on the website. The number on our website is a direct line to me, so you'll not be going to somebody else. I'm more than happy to talk about the work we do at any time. We're also very active on Facebook and on LinkedIn, and my personal account is active on LinkedIn, just talking about most things related to leadership and things that concern us in the sector as well. So we'd love to connect with people through there as well.
Thank you. And I'll put all of the contact details for Kelvin and also for Hopewell Community Care in the show note. Kelvin, I can't thank you enough for joining me in this conversation. And whether our listeners work in the complex disability space or not, these conversations are really important for those of us, which is our entire audience, working in helping professions and also leaders navigating, some of these ethical considerations and these competing demands. So thank you so much for joining me.
I've had such a pleasure talking about this. It's a conversation that we need to have a lot more of, if I'm honest with you. This is a good start, and I appreciate you just giving me the opportunity to come and share some of the reflection on my time in the sector so far. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me on Not Another PD. If this episode was helpful and you'd like to find out more, you'll find ways to work with me in the show notes. And if there's a topic you would like covered or someone you think should be on the podcast, I'd love to hear from you. Remember, clear boundaries don't just protect our clients, they protect us too.